Hello, and welcome to our Micro Summit event focused on Pulse Protein. My name is Julianne Curran, and I'm the VP of Market Innovation at Pulse Canada. I'll be your host and moderator for today's session. For this event, we've brought together experts that can answer your questions on all things Pulse Protein, including marketing, nutrition, sustainability, functionality, and performance. You'll be able to access many of the Canadian Pulse ingredient processors here as well. Before I introduce today's panelists, I just have a few housekeeping items to cover. To ask a question or chat with other attendees viewing the session, just type your message into the chat panel on the right-hand side of the screen. Unfortunately, we won't have time to address audience questions during the panel, but please do submit them, as we will be using your questions to fuel the conversation in the discussion rooms. If you find you're having any issues during the session, try refreshing your browser and be sure that the session player is set to play, not pause. Finally, please join us after the panel session in one of our discussion rooms. You'll be able to access these rooms under today's agenda on the platform. Each room will center around a specific topic and feature our expert panelists. Come to listen in or ask your own questions. These rooms will operate like Zoom meetings where you'll be able to see and hear all the participants. So we hope it'll be a nice change to be able to connect in this way. Now it's time to introduce today's panel of experts to talk about marketing Pulse Proteins. Kris Sollid is the Senior Director, Nutrition Communications at the International Food Information Council, or PHEc, and has been with PHEc since 2009. Kris Marinangeli is the Senior Director, Research and Regulatory Affairs at Pulse Canada, and has been with the organization for 6 years. Denis Tremorin is Director of Sustainability at Pulse Canada and has been with the organization for 11 years. And Sue Ma is an award-winning dietitian, president of Nutrition Solutions, and co-founder of Nutrition for Non-Nutritionists. I'm going to turn things over to Kris Sollid to kick things off. And while Kris is pulling up his presentation, I'll just mention that Kris's role at PHEc includes leading consumer research projects, engaging with social and traditional media, as well as authoring consumer and peer-reviewed publications. So Kris, we can see your slides. And yeah, if you just want to go into we see you in presenter mode. So you're ready to go whenever.
Okay, well, thank you, Julianne, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you all today. Before I get started, I just wanted to share a quick bit about PHEc, if you're not familiar with our organization. So in simple terms, PHEc looks to set the internet straight on a lot of the misleading and conflicting information that people find out there. And it's gotten to the point where people have actually told us that they believe doing their own taxes is harder than finding out how to eat healthy. So I like to think of PHEc as the TurboTax for food, if you will. We provide verified, evidence-based information that's rooted in science that helps the consumer make more informed choices about the foods that they eat. And in business jargon, we're a 501c3 educational organization. We're supported by food, beverage, and agriculture companies. Many of you in the audience are maybe members of PHEc or certainly a part of the food industry. So we're supported by those folks. And all of our members share our mission and our passion to effectively communicate food-related science information. So if you go to phec.org, you can find out more about our organization. And if you go to foodinsight.org, you can find PHEc's Content Hub. So one of the primary areas of emphasis of PHEc is consumer research. We conduct many surveys. We hope to find knowledge gaps with consumers and create resources that help fill those knowledge gaps. And what I'm going to be sharing with you today is a smattering of information that we've gathered over the last couple of years. Primarily, our main research project is our food and health survey. We've conducted conducted it every year for the last 16 years. And some of the other information that we gather is more topical. So I'm going to be sharing some surveys related to climate change and things around plant-based. So I want to start with protein trends. What we've seen over the last year is that consumers have told us there are certain proteins they're consuming more of, and plant-based or protein from plant sources is actually the top source of protein that consumers have indicated that they're consuming more of over the last year. It's down slightly from last year, but it did not see the significant decreases that we saw in things like poultry and eggs in terms of protein consumption over the last 12 months. In a separate survey, we asked consumers to tell us more about the protein choices they're making in the last year. So this survey comes from looking at 2020. And consumers report intake of a wide range of new protein sources from plants. And I've highlighted here where you can just see where legumes fall on this list, somewhere middle of the pack. So about 20% of people tell us they've tried a new variety of legumes in 2020. Now, in addition to specific nutrients and foods, we're also interested in tracking trends on the types of diets people consume. And over the last few years, what we've found is that intermittent fasting and clean eating have been the top two most reported diets or most popular diets that people have attempted within the last year. And just in 2021, we did find that a type of diet where calories are important, calorie counting, rose above those last two. But generally speaking, over the last few years, has been clean eating and intermittent fasting being the top dietary trends. Now, I've highlighted plant-based proteins, plant-based diets, so you can see where it falls, slightly above middle of the pack. And over the last few years, about 5% of people report trying a plant-based diet within the last year. So in the previous question, we did not provide any definitions for these types of diets. We let the consumer drive that based on their own interpretation of what that diet pertains, what it means to them. But in this question from a couple of years ago in our food and health survey, we wanted to know more about how consumers define plant-based diets. So I assume that many of you in this audience might have differing definitions of what a plant-based diet is. So I just wanted you to pause on that for a second, think about how you would define it. And now I'll show you how consumers defined it. What we found is that about a third of people declared it to be more along the lines of a vegan diet, where it excludes all animal foods. About 30% of people defined it as something that emphasizes minimally processed whole foods, but allows limited consumption of animal foods. And almost 20% of people view it more along the lines of a vegetarian diet. And finally, about 10% of people view it as a diet that you try to include as many fruits and vegetables as possible, but there are no limits or guidelines on consumption of animal foods. And about 10% are unsure about how they might define what a plant-based diet means. So a couple of years ago in 2019, instead of asking people to look back over the last year, we asked people to look back over the last decade. So how has your diet changed in the last 10 years? And what we found were the top two responses were limiting sugar intake and increasing the amount of fruits and vegetables that people consume. So I find this interesting. I'm not sure how many of you follow NHANES in the US, but it's a dietary tracking survey run by the government here in the States. And it's interesting that while the limit on sugar intake aligns very well with our consumption surveys being reduced over the last decade or two, the amount of fruits and vegetables people report consuming has not changed, or maybe the amount they report consuming in our survey has increased. But we know from other surveys that this is very steady over time. Only about 10% of people meet the recommendations for fruit and vegetable intake. Yet in our survey over the last decade, we're having people report that they're consuming more. But we do know that consumers, actually I should say that one interesting finding here is that what you'll notice is that people do not cite anything related to environmental impact of choices they're making in their food over the last decade. But in other surveys, we do know that people view the health of the planet as important, in addition to the health of themselves. And there is a connection between those two those two things in the food choices people are making. So in this section, I'm going to move on to just a little bit more about that intersection between planet health and personal health. So environmentally friendly food products and other products are more wide-ranging. They've reached all sectors. And about 6 in 10 Americans report to us that they're making environmentally friendly food choices in at least some aspects of their life. And food and beverages far and away lead the sectors or the categories that people are making those environmentally friendly food choices in. And this outpaces things like cleaning supplies, furniture, automobiles. So it's very important. People tend to think of food and beverages as one of the first choices they can make in improving the health of the planet. But there are more compelling factors than environmental sustainability when it comes to food choices. We've conducted the Food and Health Survey since 2006, and this is a question we've asked every year in our survey, and it asks people what are the top drivers for their food choices. And what's interesting to take away from this slide is between the factors of taste, price, healthfulness, and convenience, the rank order in the responses to this survey has not changed in 16 years. Taste consistently ranks as the #1 driver in food and beverage choices, followed by price, followed by healthfulness, followed by convenience. Although the percentages have shifted slightly from year to year, that rank order has not changed. And recently we started tracking the influence of environmental sustainability. And you see where that falls in comparison to these other factors down toward the bottom, and over time has not outpaced any of these other factors. But when consumers think about environmentally sustainable diets, moving into some protein factors, people view environmentally sustainable diets as being able to include both animal and plant proteins. But consumers do realize there is an impact of the different types of choices they are making with their food. And generally speaking, what we see here is that consumers view plant choices as having a gentler impact on the environment compared to animal choices in their foods. And finally, we know there is a difference in terms of how foods are labeled on package and how that affects perception of healthfulness. So this is an exercise we've undertaken in our Food and Health Survey that poses a nutrition facts label to consumers and asks them to compare two nutritionally identical products that only differ by one factor and one description. So there's a lot of information here on this slide, and I'm happy to get to it in the breakouts. But what I wanted to draw your attention to was the impact of descriptions like plant-based food, having a small carbon footprint, clean ingredients, products that have a clean ingredients, and products that are described as all natural on the label. Each one of them seems to have a bigger influence on the perception of healthfulness than products that do not have such descriptions on the label. So while there may or may not be a connection to personal health based on these descriptions, consumers are perceiving that to be so. And I believe that is the last slide I have for you today. I look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kris. PHEc sure has done a great job to understand better consumer perceptions of plant-based and plant-based products. And I'm sure your presentation has generated a lot of thoughts and questions for the attendees. And so please hold on to those or put them in the Q&A, and we'll have a chance to dive deeper into that dialogue with Kris into the discussion room. But I think also most importantly, Kris, you've really set the stage for the next presentations we're going to have. One thing you shared in particular was that being labeled as a good source of protein is most important for consumers as a consideration when they're buying plant-based foods. And that's exactly what our next speaker is going to talk more about. So while Kris Marinangeli is queuing up his slides, I'll just mention that, oh, that was very fast. Just a little more background on Kris. Kris has a PhD in human nutritional sciences and is also a registered dietitian. Prior to joining Pulse Canada, Kris worked for Kellogg Canada as the Senior Manager of Nutrition, Science, and Regulatory Affairs. So Kris, we're ready. We can see your slides, so go ahead and begin.
Great. Thank you, Julianne, for the introduction. In the interest of time, I'm gonna jump right in and talk about protein and navigating North America's regulatory environment. I am gonna focus primarily on Canada, but I am gonna have some touch points between Canada and the US to highlight some differences and some things to be cognizant of. Talking about protein regulations, and touch upon also some of the other nutritional challenges that we do see. Before I typically give a presentation like this, I like to talk about trends just to show how strong protein is being leveraged within the marketplace and the value proposition that consumers have for protein, which has really underpinned a lot of the food innovation we've seen. And Kris touched on this earlier. So protein has been on trend with respect to food innovation for 10 to 12 years now. And about 5 or 6 years ago, this idea around plant-based foods started to rear its head, creating a macro trend around plant-based protein. And that's no different in 2021, where you're seeing a little bit more diversity in terms of the trends around protein with animal protein, more alternative proteins, and plants made convenient. But I would say that the macro trend around plant-based foods and protein remains strong. And this really supports what Kris was talking about previously, that there is acknowledgement that we're living in a changing world and acknowledging the effects of diet and health on the environment, and the consumer value proposition for protein or plant protein can be whether it's their own personal health or sustainability. But the bottom line is we're inundated with the notion that plant-based proteins are healthy in terms of personal health or the environment, and where your value proposition is in that space can change. But generally speaking, these are the messages coming out from global discussions. So there is a pull for industry to have the ability to make source of protein claims on food, to identify foods as a source of protein, or even more specifically as a plant-based source of protein. The challenge in North America with this is that to make a source of protein claim on pack, it's not only, or in labeling or in advertising, it's not only a function of the quantity of protein in a food per serving or regulated serving size, reference amount customarily consumed in the US. It's also a function of the protein quality within a given food. And there are measures of protein quality that differ between Canada and the US, which can make innovation in some cases difficult if you wanted to leverage protein on both sides of the border. Without getting into a great deal of detail on this, in Canada, we use the protein efficiency ratio to generate a protein rating, which is a rat growth bioassay. In the United States, we use what is the protein digestibility corrected amino score, which is considered to be a more accurate depiction of protein quality related to humans. They can generate, applying both of these measures can generate a protein claim in one jurisdiction and not in the other. And it does create some challenges in this space. I think it's important to ask the question, so what is protein quality? Well, it describes the characteristics of a protein in relation to its ability to achieve defined metabolic actions. So generally, it's contingent on the supply of indispensable amino acids and the digestibility of indispensable amino acids in a food. And that is the ability to digest, consume protein into its building blocks or amino acids, absorb those amino acids, and assimilate them into biological functions. There are 11 indispensable amino acids that are typically used to calculate the protein quality of a food. So where does the challenge lie in this space? Well, generally speaking, plant-based sources of protein have a lower protein quality than animal-based sources of protein, which can generate some inherent challenges with respect to making protein content claims in the North American marketplace. The reason for that is that while animal-based proteins can be high in protein, they generally consume all of the indispensable amino acids in relative proportions that are similar to the requirements for humans, and the digestibility values are generally greater than 90%. On the plant-based side of things, while these sources of protein can be high in protein on a per serving basis, generally they have lower levels of one or more indispensable amino acids relative to requirements for indispensable amino acids in humans, and digestibility values can be moderate to high, ranging from about 70 to greater than 90%. So for these reasons, generally speaking, plant-based sources of protein have a lower protein quality, which can impact the ability to make protein claims. And just to show this as a graph, on the y-axis, we have the PHEc, which is the measure of protein quality used in the US to quantify protein content claims. On the x-axis, we have a number of foods ranging from mainly animal sources of protein to plant-based sources of protein as you move from the left side to the right side. And you can see outside of soy protein, there's generally a large drop in the protein quality of plant-based foods relative to animal-based foods. If we apply that to the regulatory framework in Canada, you can see that things like pulses consumed in their inherent form on the plate, or even almonds, these foods are talked about to some extent in dietary guidelines as plant sources of protein, but in the labeling and advertising of these foods in their inherent form, they're unable for the most part to make protein claims, impacting the ability to communicate these foods as a source of protein to consumers. And this presents a challenge, but also an opportunity as we look to innovation using plant-based sources of protein. For example, dairy alternatives, you can see here that when we look at cow's milk, for example, we look at some dairy alternatives like almond milk and rice outside of soy, you generally have a fairly large drop off in protein content and probably and also protein quality, but also you're not getting the same, without discretionary fortification, you're not getting the same levels of calcium, vitamin D, and vitamin B12 as you're finding in milk. And cow's milk in Canada, for example, is mandated to be fortified with vitamin D. This has been highlighted in the scientific literature with a recent review and analyses of various plant-based dairy alternatives in the marketplace, where it was indicated that milk substitutes in particular vary widely in nutritional quality. And with the exception of soy beverages, most products contain relatively little protein. Therefore, is a need for more plant-based products with protein levels comparable to cow's milk. And focusing in on nutrition will increase the value proposition of these foods. So what can we do in the innovation space? Well, we can apply a fairly old notion around protein complementarity in our food innovation to make up for indispensable amino shortfalls in plant-based food products. As an example of this, again, on the y-axis, we have the PHEc value. On the x-axis, we have inclusion rates of pulses. And starting off with almonds on their own, which have a fairly low protein quality, adding modest amounts of various pulses, you can get a fairly stark jump in the PHEc value of an innovative food product. You can see as you move across the x-axis, PHEc values generally taper off or decrease. That's because in this area, you're generating another indispensable amino acid imbalance. We see this in the marketplace. So here we have two dairy alternatives. One is an almond beverage containing only almonds as a source of protein, as the protein source or ingredient, where you have 1 gram of almond per serving, 1 gram of protein per serving, where the primary ingredient is almonds, versus an almond cashew beverage containing almonds, pea, and cashew, allowing the industry stakeholder to make a nutrient content claim around protein and getting that complementarity. Even beyond protein, there are some challenges. So a lot of the innovation that we're seeing is focusing on sensory profile and technical functionality, which is obviously important for consumers to adopt these foods into dietary patterns. But talking to, for example, venture capitalists, this was an interview in Forbes with Arif Fazal, which indicated there's still white space around the trifecta of taste, price, and nutritional profile. There's been considerable development in the first two, but nutritional profiles have left something to be desired. Stakeholders want to see more tasty products that are also highly nutritionally dense. When we look at modeling analysis, for example, looking at the Canadian Community Health Survey, where they simulated intake was derived by doubling the intake of plant-based meat alternatives and reducing the intake of red meat in half by CCH in our national dietary survey. And this is without fortification regulations applied. Note that in many instances, dietary patterns didn't change, but there were significant decreases in protein, zinc, and vitamin B12, as well as significant increases in fiber. But this can present some challenges as innovative plant protein foods make their way into dietary patterns at an increasing rate. There are approaches from a regulatory perspective in Canada to mitigate risk, and they have been in place for quite a while. So just some differences between two similar products sold on both sides of the border. For dairy alternatives in Canada, you cannot call them milks. They are referred to as beverages. There are thresholds for protein quality, and if they don't meet those thresholds, you have to indicate that the beverage is not a source of protein. And if you fortify the food in Canada, you have to indicate that it is a fortified, whatever the ingredient is, beverage. So in this case, a fortified almond beverage as an example. For simulated meat products in Canada, these are simulated meat and alternative poultry products that are meant to mimic the use of these products mimic meat or poultry in the diet. There are also protein content and quality requirements. You can add indispensable amino acids to improve or increase the protein quality of the food. There are also vitamin and mineral fortification requirements if you're not meeting specific nutritional thresholds. And you must indicate that these foods are simulated products that contain no meat or poultry. It's important to note that late last year, the CFIA in Canada launched a consultation to expand the category of these types of foods in the marketplace. So today we have two categories. We have meat and poultry products, and then we have corresponding simulated meat products and poultry products, where you have those fortification and protein quality requirements. The proposal is to add a third category for patty or burger type products that are not meant to mimic meat or poultry products in the marketplace, where they would be exempt from these fortification and protein quality rules. This policy, as far as I know, has not come into place, but hopefully we'll see something soon. And I just want to end the presentation, my last few slides, just to note that the regulatory environment around protein and nutrient density of innovative foods is a contentious topic, and it's been the topic of a lot of conversations, discussions in the academic and regulatory space. And if anyone would like to have a few articles that we've collaborated to put together, we'd be open to sharing them with any of the audience members. And just to end off, I just want to show that the idea around regulations of protein content claims and some of the risks are quite real. In the last 2 months, there's been 2 lawsuits put forth against industry stakeholders for allegedly inflating the protein content claims and not adhering to regulations around protein quality for their food products. So while protein claims might rank a little bit lower on risk, I think given the innovation that we're seeing in the marketplace, stakeholders and perhaps regulators and consumers are paying a little bit more attention to this area. And with that, thank you very much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kris. I love that you highlighted the opportunity for blending and the importance of nutrition for plant-based products. So we'll have a chance to talk with you more about nutrition regulations and also nutritional pulses at the end of the session and also in the discussion room. The data that we saw from PHEc in our first presentation showed that a product that's positioned as being sustainably produced is perceived to be healthier by consumers. And that really set the stage nicely for what we're going to hear from Denis. So I'm going to turn it over to him to share the science that we have available to support the sustainability story for pulses and pulse proteins. So while Denis is queuing up there, I'll just mention that Denis is a professional agrologist with a master's degree in soil science and a bachelor's degree in agroecology. And prior to joining Pulse Canada, Denis worked for 4 years as a nutrient management specialist with High Life. So we can see your slides, Denis. You can go ahead and begin.
Hey, thank you, Julianne. It looks like everything's working good here, so I'm just gonna dive right in. Really, the purpose of this talk today is to talk about pulses in the Canadian context, and really to talk about how Canadian pulses contribute to the sustainability of food systems and agricultural systems around the world. So just to get going, I think one thing that was mentioned earlier was that there's quite a few consumers that are considering sustainability and the environment as part of their decision-making process around foods. And I would just say that they're not wrong. Food and agricultural production has very large impacts environmentally around the globe. It's the largest. It has the largest impact on things like land use and biodiversity globally, because agriculture requires so much space to produce food. And also, when it comes to fresh water, the consumption of fresh water is dominated by agriculture around the world. It also has large impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. And for example, it may only be 26% of total human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, but the World Resources Institute has noted that if we want to, if our goal is to limit the amount of climate change we have to 1.5 degrees, which is kind of seen as the limit as to how we can continue living in a comfortable space globally, we need to make changes both to the production and the consumption of the foods that we eat around the world. We won't be able to achieve that goal without those changes in food and agricultural production as well, and consumption. And pulses really at the end of the day make a large contribution to this, or can. Pulses have this inherent ability to fix nitrogen from the air, which displaces the need for nitrogen fertilizers in our crop production systems. And that's really the largest impact that we would see in greenhouse gas emissions from especially crop production systems globally. So that really gives pulses a leg up in the world of greenhouse gas emissions and foods. And when you look at when you compare pulses compared to other plant proteins or even other animal sources of protein as well, we see that they're one of the lowest greenhouse gas foods in the world. They have the lowest carbon footprint of almost any food, very much lower than animal sources of protein. I'd also know that there's variability within these numbers. So when we hear some numbers like beef or even on the dairy side, the numbers can vary quite a bit based on where the country is. So I'd note that Canadian beef and Canadian dairy, for example, have some of the lowest footprints in the world. But at the same time, the plant-based source of pulses really makes a large difference because it's so much lower than these other sources. When it comes to Canadian pulses, the other aspect that we can we can speak about is that our pulses in Canada can be measured as being negative in terms of the carbon balance. And that's because the inherent emissions associated with pulses are low because of the amount of fertilizer that we need to use is much lower than other crops. But the other thing is that, especially in Western Canada, where we grow the majority of our pulses like peas, lentils, and chickpeas, the majority of that production is under no-till and has other practices that farmers have put in place that are helping to sequester carbon in our soils. So effectively, we're counterbalancing the very little amount of emissions we have from our production system with this carbon sequestration in the soils where we grow pulses. And that benefit of carbon sequestration, it gets attributed across the entire rotation, because we don't grow pulses on their own. We grow them year after year with other crops like cereals and wheat, or oil seeds like canola. And I think what we can also say is that pulses in Canada in particular make a real significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions nationally. The entire crop production system in Canada produces about 25 megatons or million tons of CO2 per year. And the production of peas and lentils in Western Canada alone has been able to displace 1 million of those tons. So instead of it being 26 million tons of production, now we would have 25 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions or carbon dioxide. And that's due to the assumption that if we weren't growing pulses, we would have a shifting of crops towards crops that would be producing more greenhouse gas emissions, such as cereals or oil seeds like canola. And we also account for the fact that when we grow pulses like peas and lentils, there is a benefit to the following crop, especially with cereals or even oil seeds, where we see that there can be a boost in production due to the leftover nitrogen that comes with the peas and lentils. So there's a benefit that basically it boosts yields and actually limits the amount of nitrogen that we need to apply in the following year. So we're accounting for that in this too. So essentially, if we grow our industry, what we say is, well, this impact will grow with it. So investments and the growth of our sector in the pulse sector across Canada is beneficial to national targets around greenhouse gas emissions, and it can even be applied to corporate targets around sustainability for companies that are buying and utilizing pulses. I wanted to make a note here also, because there's lots of discussions around regenerative agriculture these days. And I wanted to just talk about what are the principles of regenerative agriculture and how do pulses and Canadian agriculture fit in that discussion inherently. So the 6 main principles of regenerative agriculture are, and this is as defined by General Mills, which is one of the companies that really has been utilizing regenerative agriculture are reduced tillage, keeping the soil covered, maximizing crop diversity, understanding the context of that system, having living roots in the soil as long as possible throughout the year, and then integrating livestock into a cropping system. And I just wanted to say that within these principles, where we grow pulses, we really consider the top three as something that we inherently do. So the majority of our producers have been moving towards something called no-till or reduced tillage, and that helps keep the soil covered and reduces erosion and helps sequester carbon in our soils and make them more resilient within the cropping system. And then the idea of pulses inherently is that we're diversifying that crop rotation. And also, in order to adopt these type of things, you need to understand that context of the system. So I think, Canadian farmers are actually well positioned with this in discussion around regenerative agriculture. I think there's an approach being taken in terms of applying an approach that's really structured around regenerative agriculture. But I think we've already got a lot to leverage within what we do already as farmers every day. I shouldn't say we because I'm not a farmer, but the people that we represent every day think and do a lot of these things already. So there's lots to leverage within that context. The next few slides, I just want to present some of the research that we've conducted, and we've seen similar research around the world around this idea. Well, how do we leverage that sustainability benefit of pulses within food applications? So a few years ago, we did a study with ETH, which is a research institution in Switzerland, and we looked at, well, what's the impact nutritionally and environmentally of reformulating traditional cereal-based foods like pan bread, breakfast cereal, and pasta. And what we found was when you reformulate these products with these reformulations, which were provided by the Canadian International Grains Institute and were tested in terms of palatability and product quality, we found that with utilizing pea flour or lentil flour, we saw improvements in the nutritional profile of those foods. We also saw decreases in the greenhouse gas impacts of those foods, or the carbon footprint of those foods. And the increase, or the benefit of that, was increased with the amount of flour that was included in the product, but it was also impacted by the type of manufacturing that would be involved in the process of producing those foods. And I think that's something that we need to consider when you're talking about food products. Is the farm footprint is usually one of the largest footprints that you need to consider. So that's where pulses usually get the most benefit from. But with certain products that have more processing, you need to also consider, well, what are the impacts of that processing? How large of an impact is it within the total food product? And then what can we do to help minimize the impacts of that food processing? So the example here given is pea flour within breakfast cereal should have the highest amount of impact, but because the manufacturing of that breakfast cereal is more intensive, the benefits of the pulses kind of get watered down compared to producing a pasta, which is just extruded through a press. And then the last slide here I really have to talk about is when we talk about reformulating meat products, or especially meat products in this case, we really see a large benefit to including any type of pulse into those products. So in this case, we used a lentil puree to reformulate Canadian beef patties at a 33%. And what we found was there was nutritional benefits to including lentil puree, but also there was large environmental benefits. Basically, a one-to-one replacement of lentil puree basically decreased the same amount of the same level of environmental impacts, whether it be greenhouse gas emissions, water use, or land use. And that's just because the discrepancy between these two products is so high that replacing them with lentil puree basically displaces all of those environmental benefits, or all those environmental impacts. And that was another study that we published with a colleague that we had met in Switzerland. And that paper has been published and is available as well, and can be shared with colleagues that want to ask about it. So Julianne, that was my last slide. I'd be happy to continue the discussion later. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Dennis. So there's certainly a lot of complexity behind the term sustainability, as was apparent by your presentation, Dennis. And it'll be interesting to discuss later on how these different aspects of sustainability are perceived by the consumer, but also how to communicate this information to consumers. So on that note, we're going to turn things over to Sue Ma. And while Sue's queuing up her slides, I'll just mention that Sue's global consulting firm specializes in strategic nutrition communications, nutrition, education, and product innovation. So Sue is a spokesperson and writer for numerous food industry and health agencies and is a recognized media dietitian. So Sue, we're ready to go. We can see your slides in presentation mode.
Great. Thank you so much, Julianne, for that wonderful introduction, and congratulations to all of the previous speakers for sharing such fantastic information. My presentation will talk about communicating for success and really just tie things together. So for those who don't know me, I'm a dietitian. I'm the president and founder of a company called Nutrition Solutions, where I consult with global brands, national, international, global brands, really looking at strategic nutrition communications and helping the brands position themselves. This is just a snapshot of my client portfolio and some of the brands and food companies that I've worked with over the years. So I should also mention that I'm a daughter of a chef. So I grew up eating delicious, wholesome food, and I wanted to start my presentation with a story about food. So when my daughter was about 7 years old, I made a chickpea chocolate cake, and it called for chocolate chips, eggs, sugar, and a can of chickpeas, which I pureed. And so when I served this to my daughter, she was 7 at the time, she said to me, "Mom, I'm so lucky. I got the piece without any beans in it." And I just giggled because, you know, taste is so important. Obviously, the cake tasted amazing, but she wasn't even aware that there were any beans or chickpeas in the cake. And to this day, she's a teenager now, this is still one of her favorite cakes, the chickpea chocolate cake, which you can find on my website, by the way. Okay, so communicating for success. I wanted to share a framework for communicating for success. So I'm going to walk you through the who, the what, the so what, the now what, and the by whom. Let's start with who. Who is your audience? Who is it that you're talking to when you're trying to convey information about your product? And so you want to look at the demographics, the age, the gender, the ethnicity, the health status, and the location of your audience. So for example, research from Dalhousie University here in Halifax, Canada, found that about 10% of Canadians say that they're either vegetarian or vegan, and the majority of those consumers are millennials. Now, another 10% say that they are flexitarians, so a flexible vegetarian. And the majority of flexitarians in Canada are baby boomers. So you see how age can have an impact. Location. Most of the vegetarians and vegans say that they live in either British Columbia or Ontario, compared to consumers living in Alberta or the prairie provinces where there are fewer vegetarians or vegans. What about psychographics? So psychographics looks at the interests of your audience, the activities, opinions, attitudes, beliefs, and values. And here, gender can also come into play. So for example, that same research by Dalhousie University found that women were more likely to be concerned with animal welfare than men. Women were also more likely to say that meat can be replaced by other plant proteins and protein sources, whereas men tended to say that meat is one of life's greatest pleasures. And when it comes to beliefs and values and attitudes, some other things to think about are barriers to eating pulses. What are the barriers? What are consumers saying? Is it the taste? Is it the texture? Is it the knowledge? Maybe people don't know what to do with beans or how to cook beans. And also, what about the language? So we've seen terms like plant-based, but what about terms like plant-forward, plant-centric, or just plant foods? Which of these terms resonate most with your audience? These are all things to think about. So that's the who. Now let's move on to the what. What's the situation? What's the problem? What's the new research? Are there any new statistics? So in Canada, we have a new food guide that came out about 2 years ago in 2019. And the food guide suggests that half our plate be made up of fruits and vegetables, a quarter of the plate from protein, and another quarter of the plate from whole grains. And for the first time ever, the food guide had advice to enjoy plant-based proteins. And in fact, the direction is that plant-based proteins can provide more fiber and less saturated fat than other protein foods. Now, in that same year, the Eat Lancet Commission released their planetary health plate. And they also emphasize a plant-forward diet that emphasizes and celebrates foods from plant-based sources. So again, it's a similar plate, half the plate fruits and vegetables, a good chunk of the plate whole grains, and a good chunk of the plate plant-sourced proteins. That's that light mint green pie of the chart. And it's interesting that they use the term plant-sourced proteins. So there's a lot of different language and lingo out there, and we need to keep that in mind as we're talking to our audience. Menus of Change. So this is a joint initiative between the Culinary Institute of America and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And some of the data they shared was that there's been a 328% growth in the term plant-based on US menus from 2018 to 2019. So there's a huge interest in plant-based foods when consumers are eating out. 44% of consumers in Canada and also in the USA are trying to eat more plant-based proteins like beans and nuts. But here's a problem. Only 5% of Americans are eating the recommended amount of fiber. So there's a great opportunity for manufacturers to innovate and help consumers reach their fiber intake for the day. What about here in Canada? Well, on any given day, only 13% of Canadians are consuming pulses. And research from Abacus Data found that 79% of Canadians say that they're cooking more often at home now and will continue to do so after the pandemic. So that's good news. There's an opportunity to help share recipes and inspire consumers to enjoy more pulses. So we talked about the who, the what, now the so what. Why is this important? How does this affect me? And why should I care about this issue? Why should I care about your new product? This is your opportunity to share the relevance and impact of your product or your ingredient. So how do pulses address the problem? Or how does it solve my pain point? And as our previous speakers mentioned, pulses can help in so many different ways. Pulses can help with personal health. Maybe the consumer is concerned about their heart health or their gut health, or maybe they want better blood sugar control. Maybe they're concerned about planetary health and sustainable eating. So maybe this is the message that you want to share. Or maybe it's about cooking skills and saving money on food. You know, we know that pulses are an economical source of protein and food prices are just on the rise. I believe Statistics Canada has indicated that there's a 4 to 6% increase in the price of food. So to help consumers, maybe eating and enjoying pulses is a great way to save money. And because we know Canadians are in the kitchen cooking, it's a great opportunity to boost their cooking skills and let them experiment with different recipes that use pulses. Now what? So we've talked about the who, the what, the so what, and the now what. So the now what is the call to action. What can I do? What is it that you want the consumer to do now that you've given them all of this information? Well, I think the bottom line is that we want them to explore and enjoy pulses. And what can this mean? This can mean that maybe you're sharing recipes or videos, 89 ways to use lentils. Maybe you're sharing a video about a farmer who's growing lentils or pulses. Maybe it's a TV interview. Maybe it's a specific call to action. For example, swap out half the meat and put half lentils when making your burger. Or maybe it's another call to action, like sign up for the half cup habit challenge, where the challenge is to enjoy half a cup of pulses three times a week. So you need to think about what your message is. Is it specific? Is it general? And how does it help the consumer or the audience enjoy more pulses? And finally, by whom? Who's telling the story? And this one is so important. So my advice is to work with credible experts with influence who can communicate a clear message. Maybe it's a chef who can do a recipe demo, and show inspiring, creative ways to use pulses. Maybe it's a farmer who's describing how lentils are grown on their farm. What are the conditions that are required? What are the challenges they face when they try to grow this crop? Or maybe it's a dietitian. As dietitians, we're trusted food and nutrition experts, and we have credibility because our messages are evidence-based. And maybe it's the dietitian who's sharing the message with your audience. Bottom line is that you want to work with somebody who's credible, who can provide a compelling, concise, clear, and evidence-based message. So my summary: who, what, so what, now what, and by whom. Think about the demographics. Think about the psychographics of your audience. Describe the problem. What's the issue? Describe the so what. What's the relevance and impact? Why should people care about what you want to say? Be very clear with your now what. What's the call to action? What is it that you want your audience to do? And then think carefully about your partners. Who's going to help tell the story? Look for credible and trusted experts such as dietitians, a farmer, or a chef. And there's my contact information. I just wanted to mention that I also have a company called Nutrition for Non-Nutritionists, where we have an online nutrition course for non-nutritionists just like you, where you can learn about health and nutrition trends. We also share information about nutrition claims and regulatory aspects of food labels in Canada. Feel free to reach out to me if you'd like more information, and I'd be happy to chat with you in the discussion room.
Great. Thank you, Sue. Certainly, as consumers are becoming more knowledgeable about food and health and are accessing all kinds of information on the food they eat, having credible experts and evidence-based marketing messages is really key. So we're going to bring back all of our panelists now. We have time for just a brief discussion before we close the panel and move to the discussion rooms. So I think what we'll do in the interest of time is I'm just going to pose a question that I think all four of the panelists can weigh in on. And it's really around sort of what's happening in this whole plant-based space. With the food products, the focus has been to date to really deliver on taste, texture, performance in terms of consumer experience with these products. And so as a result, as we saw in Kris Marinangeli's presentation and also in Kris Sollid's, we may have products that are lacking in nutritional quality, and perhaps they have a greater environmental impact than less processed products. So I'm going to ask each one of you to weigh in on your thoughts just about the path forward for plant-based foods in terms of meeting consumer drivers and what's coming next. So if we want to start off perhaps with Kris Marinangeli and Denis, what are your thoughts on what could the industry do to counteract some of the losses that come from processing on nutrition and sustainability?
Thanks, Julianne. I think the notion around processed and being unhealthy really is an artifact of, I think, some of the data that we have looking at observational data sets and the epidemiology, where there are certain algorithms or programs that sort of quantify classify foods as ultra processed or not processed. And unfortunately, a lot of these data sets do show that ultra processed foods, a term that I'm really not a fan of myself. I don't believe that categorizing foods as processed really deems them as unhealthy. But unfortunately, we do have data like that does make the news cycle, and it does resonate. I think the only reason why, well, not the only reason, but a large reason why process is in many eyes a bad word is because some of these foods are not delivering on nutrition. And I think some recalibration on the innovation side could turn things around, and using nutrient dense ingredients, being cognizant of the saturated fat, sugar, salt in products. It really is unfortunate because this process is such a spectrum. But I think prioritizing nutrition, health, and the innovation cycle can counteract some of that negative attention.
Great, thanks, Kris. Denis, a quick comment from you on sustainability perspective.
Yeah, for processing, I think really, I don't work as a food engineer, and I don't pretend to be one, but I think that's really what this is about, is understanding the process that you utilize. And there's tools like life cycle assessment, which help to identify, well, where are the hot spots within that processing that you could address. And sometimes it's about adopting technology. Sometimes it's about the world of green energy, and that in that space is evolving all the time, and things are becoming more and more affordable. And then really that's what that's about. Is it's not necessarily about having to change everything that you do. It's about understanding what it is and what is the most economical way to reduce that footprint, and to achieve a goal that you set. So
cool. Thanks, Denis. We just have time to quickly hear also from Sue and Kris on this. Where do you think consumers are at with their journey with plant-based, and is it time for industry to focus more on nutrition of these products and sustainability? And what should the balance be between taste, price, convenience, nutrition, sustainability?
Yeah, I could start. I'm not a food scientist or involved in reformulating foods, but in terms of the way they are presented on package, I think could be important. We know from our research that plant proteins can be described as good sources, or natural or organic seem to have more of a draw with consumers, whereas sometimes the environmental sustainability factors of plant-based proteins aren't as important to some people. But to those where it is important, I think it could be helpful to try to help consumers understand how they can make better choices. We see in some of our research that people want to make better choices. They view that as important to them, but they don't always know how. And a lot of people say that if they knew how, they would make, or they could make better choices that could positively impact the environment. So I don't know if it's an icon on label or anything related to that, but if they could be reassured or had some confidence that their choices are actually better for the planet, they might be more apt to make those choices.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kris. How about you, Sue?
I echo what everyone else has said. Taste is the biggest driver. If it doesn't taste great, forget about it. So as a dietitian, and my dad's a chef, taste is always number one. Secondly, we need to think about the 3 S's, so the sodium, sugars, and saturated fat of the product. Just a heads up that front of package labeling is coming to Canada soon. It was supposed to come, but COVID hit, so things are on hold. But front of package labeling is coming. So foods that are high in those 3 S's, saturated fat, sodium, or sugars, will be flagged as such. So that's something to keep in mind as you're doing your innovations.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sue. And that brings us to the end of the hour. So at this time, I'd just like to thank all of our panelists for sharing their expertise with us today, and thank all of our participants for spending this first hour with us. We now want to invite you to come into our discussion rooms, where you can have more discussion and ask questions directly to our experts. So you can access these rooms on today's agenda through the event platform. The rooms are meant to be more casual and informal to allow you to interact with fellow attendees and panelists. So feel free to look around the event platform as well. You can chat, book meetings with other attendees, find information about Pulse ingredient suppliers here as well, and check out what's on the agenda for tomorrow, because we have another great panel lined up. And so with that, I just want to formally close the panel session, and we're going to open up the discussion rooms. So we'll see you there.